Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Challenge and Behavior as an IEP Team issue. My name is Triana Miles, and I am here as a parent educator supporting Ms. Doreen Byrd. I wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping, but I'm going to give like 1 or 2 minutes for everybody to come in. And then I'm going to do the housekeeping announcement to let y'all know how we're going to do this tonight. Thank you so much for coming.
I just gotten rid of one black bar. And hello, folks. I will do another greeting when we decide that we're ready to get in. And of course, I'm not going to see things. All right. Well, Miss Trina, you tell me when people have stopped coming in, because if I do bring up my little lower bar down here, then it's probably going to block part of the screen. Do you see a little black thing showing up at the bottom of the screen? No? Okay, well, good. No. Leave that where I can see that then.
All right, it looks like those who are coming in, it has slowed down and we look like we have our part. Oh, there's another one that came in. I apologize. In the meantime, though, you are more than welcome to thank you for the introduction, Amanda. You are more than welcome to type in the chat your name and where you're from. You're more than welcome to talk about if you're a professional or a parent. Just kind of tell us a little bit about you.
Well, and
Welcome.
particularly why you're interested in this topic.
Yes.
And is there anything special that you want to learn tonight? Um,
Mm.
Part of the housekeeping that I'm sure Triana was going to go over was how
Mhm.
to ask questions. There should be a Q&A feature that you can utilize to enter questions. The chat is mainly for like technical issues that you might be having along those lines, but we'd rather have all the questions in one spot so we're not having to check two different places. So if you can use the Q&A, that would be awesome. And please enter them at any time. I've got a couple of spots where we have scheduled breaks to answer questions. If there's something that comes in that sounds like it's going to be, pressing and terribly related to what I'm talking about right that second, Triana will interrupt me and let me know that. And then I'll stop and try to answer that right then, so folks can have clarity if that's required. But otherwise, we'll wait till a little break time. I haven't timed this presentation out, but so far we've been doing pretty good in terms of getting everything within our allotted time. So hopefully that'll be the case tonight. Well, let me introduce myself while I'm on the roll. My name is Doreen Byrd. I am the lead parent educator actually with ECAC. I've been with the organization for 27 years, just about 26 and 3/4. Okay, I'll count my 27. I'm also a parent of 2 adult children that have ADHD and specific learning disabilities in writing, which is now back in the form. My daughter's taken a graduate course, and I've already gotten several of those desperate phone calls. And can you take a look at this paper? Because she's still not confident about her writing, although she's gotten much better. Let's see. I also have ADHD myself. I didn't get diagnosed until after both of them were. So managed to go through, most of life without knowing what the heck I was dealing with in terms of causing problems. But should my train of thought get derailed tonight, please forgive. It usually hops back on at some point, and we'll generally be okay. So that's about me.
And
And yeah,
And
I'm gonna say,
since Ms. Doreen has started the up all about me, I guess I'll share a little something about myself, right? So before I get started with that, please, I just want to remind everybody about the Q&A. If you don't see it at the bottom, click on the little 3 dots inside of the circle and you'll be able to see it in the more section. Again, my name is Triana Miles and I too have ADHD as an adult. However, I was diagnosed as a teenager, but we made some choices that led me here. In the meantime, I am married and have 2 children and a daughter in love, thanks to my wonderful son who has autism and ADHD and my original why. But everybody in my house has ADHD. So we are a ad hoc family.
interesting household.
Yeah, whole house. So just know that we've got a lot going on, so I completely understand. I am going to be monitoring the Q&A and the chat. For those of you who have introduced yourselves, thank you. For those repeat offenders, thank you for coming back. So I
Well, this
see a
was
couple of
intended to be
those.
intended to be a series. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy to see that some folks have decided to sort of tune
Yes.
into the multiple chapters of this story. I will say that behavior is one of the issues that comes up very frequently in terms of the reasons why people contact ECAC. And it shows up in lots of different kinds of ways. We get everything from the itty bitties that just started kindergarten,
Mm-hmm.
they're having challenges, to the high school kids and all points in between. So behavior is definitely something that's on the forefront. And honestly, if I had to guesstimate, I'd say about a third of our calls or contacts have something to do with behavior on some level.
Yeah.
If I had to
I
put
had
a
at least
number
three
on it,
today. Mm-hmm.
it's a thing.
Mm-hmm.
So
And
here
just
we
so
go.
you know, when it
Mhm.
comes down to it, I also want to make sure that everybody understands that there will be resources and information that will be shared after this before the question is asked in the chat, because that's typically asked every session. Will we get a copy of the resources? Yes. Yes, you will. Yes,
Okay.
you will. All right, take it away, Miss Doreen.
All right, spend just a second covering ECAC because there's always some folks here who aren't familiar with us, and since it's being recorded, there'll be people probably accessing it from our YouTube site or somewhere. All right, so we are a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to improving the lives of all lives and education of all children, but we have a special emphasis on children with disabilities because that's near and dear to our heart. We are a parent-run organization, and most of our board of directors are parents of children with special needs. The vast majority of our employees are parents of children with special needs, even some of the, behind-the-scenes staff that you don't see up here. All of the parent educators, who are the folks that actually talk to the parents when they call in, um, are parents of kids with special needs. And there's something comforting about that. When we talk about the parent-to-parent support, sometimes that happens more or less informally when parents realize that they're talking to somebody who at least halfway gets it, who's been in that journey of having a child that the world wasn't quite built for, and trying to make things happen for your child. ECAC does a lot of things, but we're most known for our role as North Carolina's Parent Training and Information Center. And in order to do that work, we get a grant that comes through the federal special education law and administered by the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs. In this project, we provide individual assistance, and that can take whatever form is necessary. Sometimes we just answer a single question and people go away happy. Sometimes there's a walk that we take with families. So it's about what's necessary and what the situation requires. We create education and informational materials of all sorts, ranging from fact sheets to videos. We do group trainings, such as webinars and workshops like we're doing here today, on multiple topics of interest to, again, families of children with disabilities. And we are doing more direct work with youth these days. We have a project which will show up on the next slide that I'll get to, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. But I will say the Parent Training Information Center works with families of children that have disabilities from birth all the way up through age 26. So even after they're out of school, where there is a point of contact to help with that transition to adulthood. And we also have the Family to Family Health Information Center, which does similar work in terms of providing assistance and materials and education and all that. But their primary focus is around the healthcare system and helping families navigate that. Particularly, our state-run programs like the Medicaid and the waivers and things like that. So if people have questions about those issues, then the Family to Family, which is F2F for short, um, is going to be the folks that you would want to speak to, but you just still call the main number or go through our website to reach us, and it'll get directed from there. I think that's the gist of that stuff. Ta-da. In the end of it, there'll be information about our website and all that, but that's just enough to get you oriented, as in why should you be listening to us? Okay, that's who we are. We have other projects that come through joint relationships with the Department of Health and Human Services, particularly their Division of Employment and Independence for People with Disabilities, which used to be vocational rehabilitation, and I'm finally getting the hang of that. We are partners in the North Carolina Deaf Blind Project that serves families of children that have a combination of vision and hearing impairments. You know, as you can imagine, that creates some unique challenges, and those families have a, you know, particular, you know, concerns and need supports. East Carolina University is part of that project. They work with more or less the educators on that side. We do families, and it's supervised by the Department of Public Instruction. We off and on have had multiple contracts with Department of Public Instruction to produce materials, primarily for families over time. Our newest project is this Innovative Approaches, which is a system of care systems change project. And we're trying to improve the systems that serve families of children with special healthcare needs in 4 particular counties. It's Cleveland County, Gaston, Lincoln, and Catawba, if I've got that memorized right. And I think we're still looking for a coordinator for that. So if anybody's out there interested or knows somebody who might do a great job with overseeing that program, or just want more information, you know, reach out to us and we'll be happy to talk to you about that. And occasionally, you know, various short-term projects pop up that we also participate in. But all of our work is around families, and most of it involves the entire state of North Carolina. Okay, so tonight, our objectives, I'll sort of, before I say that, our presentation is going to be kind of in 3 chunks, and we have 1 objective per chunk. So we'll state at least 2 ways that IEP teams can help children with challenging behavior. Explain the relationship between functional behavior assessment and behavior intervention plans, and explain the purpose of a manifestation determination review. So that's sort of our heads up here. We'll start off with sort of general discussion about the role of IEP teams in terms of addressing meeting children's needs, you know, the children that may have some behavioral manifestations. And then spend some time talking about positive behavior interventions and supports, because that's sort of at the centerpiece of how we're going to solve the problem, as well as something that IDEA strongly promotes. And we'll talk about some other roles that it comes into play. And then a manifestation determination review is in the context of discipline of children with disabilities. And we said that's a big thing. So that'll kind of come at the end. That's the flow here. All right, so we'll put again, establish our context here. Our federal special education law is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, better known as IDEA. And the stated purpose of the act is here, but I will read it because it's important. We have to ensure that all children with disabilities, and that all is a key thing here, ages 3 through 21 have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. So pretty much every word in this one sentence is critical and has some important content to it. But I did put bold around the things we want to focus on because we're talking about our free appropriate public education, or FAPE for short. But the appropriate piece is where the concern comes into play, because what's appropriate for one child is not necessarily going to be appropriate for another. And we want to make sure that that education is meeting this child's needs, and hence the emphasis on their unique needs. And the fact that this is intended have a long-term objective here. We're trying to prepare these students for life, okay, not just to get from one school day to the next, or 1 week to the next, or 1 year to the next. It's about getting them ready for their adult lives and sending them out into the world as prepared as they can be. Well, we're talking about the role of the IEP team. Well, who's on the team? The IEP team consists of the parent, a general education teacher, special education teacher, and somebody that represents the local education agency, which is your school district or charter school, because charter schools are considered to be their own separate LEAs. Sometimes in meetings, people will refer to an individual as this person is serving as LEA today. Well, the role officially is LEA representative, and it is in fact a role, not a job title. So there's any number of people that can serve in that role, but your 2 main qualifiers are that they have to be qualified to either deliver or supervise the delivery of special education services, and they have to be knowledgeable about the resources of the local education agency, so your school system, most of the time we're talking at, or the charter school. Okay. A lot of times it's going to be a school building administrator. Yes, there isn't a role, but there's any number of people that can. All right. So those are just your core required members that have to be there all the time. There's other people that are required under certain conditions. If we're going over evaluation results, for example, somebody has to be there who's capable of interpreting those results. If we're talking about transition to adulthood, the student has to be there. And certainly the parent or the school can invite other people to participate in the meeting if they feel they have something to contribute. So the core responsibility of this IEP team is to develop, review, and revise when necessary the Individualized Education Program, or IEP. And IEP is what's telling us about the unique needs of a child with a disability and how those needs are going to be addressed. IEPs are going to contain a statement about the child's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, specifically around areas where there had been some concerns or where assessments have been conducted, how the child's disability affects their involvement and progress in the general education curriculum. There's going to be measurable annual goals for whichever skill area the special education is focused on. Then we have the direct instructional services, the special education, and then related services such as speech, occupational, physical therapy. There's a long list of potential, orientation, mobility, a lot of different kinds of related services, but they are all designed to support the child's ability to benefit from their special education. So those things are kind of intertwined, but those are the services that help the child reach their annual goals. Then you have the supplementary aids and services that are also designed to help that child be able to, do the things that we're going to say next. But there are modifications, accommodations, and various supports that enable the child to meet their annual goals, make progress in the general education curriculum, and be educated in the least restrictive environment. One of the key principles of IDEA is that students with disabilities should be educated with students who do not have disabilities to the maximum extent possible where their needs can still be met. And of course, that's going to mean different things for different kids, but that should always be at the back of mind when we're looking at how to support kids, where to support kids, and that sort of thing. All right, so how are we dealing with, where do behaviors come into play? Well, some of these kids, when we're talking about their present levels and goals, have behavior challenges that may be part of their disability, or they may be something that's kind of on the side. And the question is, how do we address that? Well, behaviors in and of themselves aren't necessarily good, bad, or anything. Your raw definition of it is the action or reactions of persons under specified circumstances. That's one definition. I'm a psych major, and we always talked about observable actions, so the things that we can see people do, behaviors aren't what's going on in somebody's head. You can deal with what you see. And that's going to be sort of your starting point to try to figure out, is there a problem? Is there something we need to be concerned about? But sometimes there is. Some behaviors can cause real problems. They can impact learning. It may be a matter of, children don't learn very well if they're busy having a meltdown. The peers may avoid interacting with them if the students are behaving inappropriately, if they're violating their personal space, if they're, getting angry at them and going off the deep end for no particular reason. And sometimes just because they seem to be the target of a lot of negative attention, and kids don't want to be associated with that, because I think they sort of look at it as maybe a contagious thing. They don't want to find themselves under scrutiny, as well. So there's various reasons why the peers may not want to hang out with them. They may disrupt the environment for themselves and other folks. some kids engage in behaviors that actually place their health and safety at risk. They may run off without thinking about what's around them. It calls about people whose kids bolting out into the parking lot. Just yesterday, I talked to somebody whose child was discovered next to a busy street after having eloped from their classroom. So those things can be seriously injurious, and even some fairly other kinds of direct things that may place them at risk. If the kids are sitting in the office or being suspended, that kind of thing, then they're missing out on instructional opportunities. So that's costing them, in terms of their learning and potential progress. And this extends beyond just at school. These things, same factors are going to be at play in the community as well. And sometimes families of children that have challenging behaviors are more reluctant to go out and do things like go to a restaurant. There's people that don't go to church because they're afraid their child's, going to misbehave during church. Any number of things. So it can spill over and cause, problems with family, siblings, and all that. So, again, behavior by definition isn't good or bad, but yes, there are some behaviors that do create problems for the individual and the people around them. Well, if IEP team is working with a child who is exhibiting some behaviors that are causing problems for themselves or are limiting their development in terms of being able to grow into new skills or have more freedoms and that kind of thing, then they really should be addressing that. And part of that means that they should be given consideration to any supports that are possible. So we're looking at different parts of the IEP: services, interventions, devices, accommodations, changes to the program, whatever it is that might be necessary for that child to get their free, appropriate public education. So, we don't sort of turn a blind eye to that. In fact, we got a couple of different categories of eligibility that part of the eligibility criteria is that the children are exhibiting atypical behaviors. So for those, certainly the behaviors are front and center, and we know that that's part of the disability because that's sort of how they got into special ed to start with. So, those kids are going to generally have IEP goals and some efforts made to focus on them. But sometimes you have children that maybe have a different category of eligibility that doesn't automatically come with behaviors, but they do, they're experiencing that. So they still need help. So among the things that IEP teams should be thinking about is, does the student need additional special education or related services? And that may not mean just more time. It may mean different kinds of focus. Do they need more support or maybe different types of support? Parents are part of the team for a reason. Parents understand their child, know their child better than anybody else in the room. And the IEP team should be utilizing that knowledge that the parents have as part of the sort of problem-solving process to try to figure out what might be helpful, where they see the deficits or see the challenges, and the things that maybe have been tried in the past and haven't worked. Maybe some past history of the child and experiences that they've had that might be very relevant to what people are seeing. So, it is very important that parents are actively engaged and that they're given room to be actively engaged in the process of trying to figure out how best to help children through these things. There's some, when the behaviors are the result of things that are caused by the disability, then it may be something that we're not necessarily going to be able to quickly sort of teach them out of. And so we may wind up having, or just correct them out of, we'll say, we may have to teach them strategies to work around their challenges. So that's what the compensatory strategies are. Kind of, if you can't fix it, then let's figure out how to get around it and keep that from being a problem. And I'll give you a case in point. And if anybody who's been listen to me in the last two things, I'm bad about telling stories or good about it, depending on how you look at it. But I had a young man one time who started off having ADHD You know, I mean, he was still a kid, but he had ADHD to start with. And because of that, wound up chasing a ball out into traffic and got hit by a car. So then he wound up with a traumatic brain injury on top of already having ADHD. So this kid had, you know, very little impulse control and was one, you know, as we go forward and talk about the positive behavior support, you know, we generally say behaviors don't come out of nowhere. And his behaviors didn't necessarily come out of nowhere, but he would go from 0 to 100 in an instant. Because he literally had neurological damage to his brain. And so some of those inhibitory sections and stuff weren't working right. So part of his strategy was to teach him how to put himself in situations where problems were less likely to occur, such as if it's in an unstructured setting at the cafeteria or out in the playground or whatever, is hanging relatively close to where the teachers are, would make it less likely that the peers were going to mess with him. You know, he had somebody dumped spaghetti on his head at some point in the cafeteria, you know, and that did not work out well. But if you're sitting near that sort of supervising teacher, then somebody's not likely to do that. So he could sort of limit the provocation, you know, by situating himself appropriately. So, you know, that was part of the how do we get this kid through it, you know, was him recognizing that, all right, I need to be away from these things, you know, that kind of stuff. So that's just one example. It's helpful if all IEP team members are knowledgeable about the resources of the school district. That is the primary, you know, qualification, or one of the primary qualifications for the LEA representative. Um, but they don't always know everything, you know, and especially again, you got building level people serving in that capacity, and they don't necessarily know all the things that are available within the district. And so instead of just kind of putting all that weight and all that burden on them, you know, I think it would be helpful for somebody, you know, if I'm an educator working within a district, I'd kind of just for my own benefit want to know what's going on, you know, and what's available out there. That could, you know, potentially help my students. You know, I have sat in an IEP meeting, and I kid you not, where we had a kid who was sitting on homebound for months. And once we got involved, somebody from central office attended a meeting, and come to the school had taken a position of, we've done all we know to do, you know, and so we're going to send this kid home. Well, that particular district had not one, not two, but three different alternative programs that they could have considered for this child. And because that nobody in the building, I guess, you know, at least nobody on the IEP team knew that, this child sat home for months. So, you know, there's some actual consequences associated with people not knowing what's out there, and what can be brought to bear to assist the kids. All parts of the IEP should be considered, because as we said, we could be talking services, we could be talking accommodations, we could be talking, you know, any number of things that might get tweaked or changed or altered to better support the student. And whatever we're going to do, you know, it's helpful to be collecting data all along. Number one is you want to have some good baseline data, you know, as far as where things stand before you start implementing changes. But if you don't have that, then at least start collecting data to see if you see positive trends. Because if things aren't going in the right direction, or God forbid they're getting worse, then, you know, hey, let's get back together again. You don't write IEPs and walk away from them. You know, there should always be a sense of how are we doing in monitoring progress. That's the whole reason why there are these periodic progress reports that come out. And so there's a way of tracking whether or not kids are performing as well as expected, and whether or not some course correction needs to happen. And we don't have to wait until the end of the year to, you know, make that so for the, and I say end of the year, I mean to the next annual review. If at any point there's concerns, somebody can call an IEP meeting to get everybody together and see what can be done. Now, part of the IEP is what we call special factors, where they ask questions. Does the student have so-and-so? And one of those questions is, does the student have behaviors that impede their learning or that of others? Well, if the team checks yes to that, then they are required. You see, it has a must underlined here. That's not a shall, should, you know, kind of thing. Is IEP team must address those behavioral needs using either positive behavior interventions and supports, IEP behavior goals, behavior intervention plan, or some combination of all three of them. Could be two here, three there, but some combination of those things. What you don't do is check that box and just walk away. And I will say that one of the flaws that I see, again, we talk about that example that I gave about the poor kid that was sitting at home without people knowing that there were other programs available. It happens in classrooms, it happens at the building level, it happens in IEP teams. Ask for help. If y'all dealing with the situation and you've pretty much tried the things that you know to try, or you're feeling like, okay, this is now beyond something, I've never seen anything like this before, or whatever, ask for help. Most of the time, the school district is going to have other personnel and specialists that can provide, if nothing else, a fresh perspective in terms of trying to take a look at the situation. But they may also have other kind of skill sets, and you need to reach out rather than let that child sit there and continue, let the problem continue to exist, or possibly even get worse. It is the responsibility of the school district as a whole. And again, when I say school district, we're including charter schools, right? So y'all don't get a pass on this. To provide that child with a free, appropriate public education. It's not just that building, it's not just that teacher, it's the district. So, again, any resources available within that school district can be brought to bear to help solve problems. Most school systems, just about all of them really, you'll have a behavior specialist. They're all going to have psychologists. Again, your charter schools contract with people for some of these services, but they're available. There's related service providers that can bring their particular skill set to situations where maybe communication challenges or sensory issues are underlying some of the behavior concerns that we're seeing. So not only can they provide direct services to the student, but they can also provide, suggestions to the teachers, even as far as environmental changes or how to work with the student, how to make accommodations to allow the student to participate without things causing problems. So, again, we can benefit from applying their skill set to the conversation. So even though they're not necessarily required team members, that might be situations where we want them at the table when we're discussing the child's behaviors. If necessary, we can bring in outside consultants. Certainly there's people, again, out there in the world that specialize in just about everything. And there's people that specialize in, that have disability specific expertise that may be important to the problem solving as well. So again, just reach out and try to take advantage of the resources that are there. One of the things that I guess most schools know about, but for some reason it tends to come up a lot that people, oh, I didn't know that. The Department of Public Instruction has some funds that they sort of set aside to provide behavior or support for students with disabilities that have pretty significant needs that exceed the district's capacity to sort of meet that. And certainly that's something that our smaller school districts, charter schools and whatever, where the resources are actually limited, can tap into to provide support to students. And a lot of times the schools think about that in terms of, oh, the kid needs a one-on-one, let's go get some money. They would prefer, honestly, to do things that build capacity within the school and the school system. So if you want to try to implement program or for training, those funds can be used for those purposes as well. And then those kind of things will help expand the ability of that school to address the needs of the next kid that comes along. It's not just about, we're going to, attack somebody to this one child. Let's look at some capacity building. So there's a whole range of things that those funds can be used for. And off the top of my head, I'm thinking maybe they could be used to bring in some outside people. I don't know. But they have to be applied for. They're there, but you have to complete an application and request the money. PRC 29 is your line item in the budget there. So, all right. We're going through sort of behaviors occurring on multiple levels of challenge in terms of some of it is just, yeah, we need to address that. Or yes, this is an issue. We need to teach Johnny not to touch people, da da da, or they need to learn personal space. Those are more or less typical kind of issues that you can establish an IEP goal for and work on and do social stories if you need to and so forth and so on. But sometimes kids have behaviors that sort of exceed that. And here's one definition of challenging behavior that I think most people could kind of agree with. It's behavior emitted by a person that results in self-injury or injury to others, causes damage to the physical environment, interferes with the acquisition of a new skill, and or socially isolates the individual. So those are some pretty significant impacts. And so if we got behavior that is resulting in these things, then those are the kind of behaviors that warrant a systematic, focused approach to trying to address them. And that's where our PBIS comes into play. So positive behavior interventions and supports. It's a framework or an approach for selecting and using evidence-based behavior intervention strategies in order to enhance academic and social outcomes for all students. And they say all students because there is a school-wide level PBIS that does, in fact, address all students in the school, whether or not they have any kind of particular behavior issues. PBIS is not a package curriculum or a set of instructions, so it's not going to be, well, if you see this, do this thing. And it has a focus on prevention. So again, it's not something that you do totally in response. Reaction. We're talking about being proactive here. As I said, there's a school-wide level, but we're going to be mainly talking about the individual PBIS and how it applies to individual students. And in that sense, it's going to be a person-centered approach to intervention for the challenging behavior. You have a whole process for designing ways to support students that are individualized based on their particular needs. It includes functional behavior assessments, FBA, you'll hear people saying that, and leading to behavior intervention plans that are positive, educational, and functional. There's a couple of key assumptions of PBIS, and the big one is that problem behavior does not occur randomly. People don't randomly spend energy doing stuff that they're not getting some kind of benefit from, or it's not serving them in some capacity. So there's a context and there's a reason why the behaviors are occurring. And the task is to try to figure that out. So problem behavior serves some sort of a function, and it may serve more than one function. It's helping that child meet some real need that's existing for them. And it can be a means of communication in a direct sort of way. And it can also be a way that the child is able to, let's put it this way, you may be able to learn something from what they're doing as far as them communicating through their behavior. Again, it's not necessarily that, hey, I'm setting out to do this thing, as a way of sending a message, but you can also get a message from it if we're keeping our eyes open and paying attention. But in order to understand the behavior, you have to understand the child and the context that behavior is occurring in. When it's all said and done, behaviors generally boil down to a desire to either obtain something or to avoid something or escape. Similar context. And those somethings can be either internal or external. So it may not be something that you see. It can be a feeling that somebody is trying to achieve or avoid. I'm trying to get food to avoid this hunger pain that I've got going on in my tummy here. I'm trying to get away from this loud noise because it's giving me a headache. Those kind of things. You got some internal experiences that you may be trying to focus on. What they may be trying to obtain could be something that's tangible, such as, actual objects or participation in some activities or experiences that they'd like to do. Or there could be some difficult things that they're trying to avoid, or things that make people uncomfortable, or things that make them bored. And so they may be trying to avoid that. Tension sort of falls in the middle because that plays both ways. There are kids that don't want attention, or they're getting it at the wrong time, and so that's causing problems for them. So behaviors can serve more than one purpose. So, don't necessarily stop with the, oh, I think it's this, and stop looking, kind of, keep the thinking cap on, and you may discover that there's a little bit more complexity to it. But if we sort of understand that there's, again, some function and some need that's being met, underlying these behaviors, then that'll take you halfway there. The process of PBIS involves assessing the situation and gathering information about what's going on, enough to formulate a plan. So that'd be your, behavior plan that's built around your working theory. You want to implement said plan, provide the interventions and changes and whatever steps are necessary, and then evaluate whether or not it's working. Again, you don't write stuff and walk away. You always want to check and see, is it working? Do we need to make changes? So for the functional behavior assessment, there's usually multiple sort of pieces to it, and there's not a one kind of cookbook, schedule for step by step, but this is sort of a best practice model, we'll say, as far as the kind of information you're trying to gain. Functional behavior assessment, I describe as an information gathering process. Okay. And you're going to be looking at whatever information is there and also generating additional stuff if necessary. So step one is identifying and describing the challenging behavior in question. So you're going to have a target behavior. So you want to figure out what that target behavior is. Most kids are going to have a range of things that they need to work on, but when you're deciding whether or not it's something that you want to spend this kind of energy on, or which behavior you want to focus on, is that, kind of start maybe at the bottom of that little list there. So something that's dangerous clearly needs to be addressed. Then something that's, distracting or disrupting the environment, work your way down from there. Something that's mainly just kind of, yeah, it's developmental. 14-year-olds are sarcastic. That's just kind of who they are. That's a low priority task, or behavior. That's not something that you may want to have a conversation about what they say to who and when, but it's not going to warrant this kind of action. So you choose your focus. You want to describe it in a way that the behavior is going to be observable, and something that you can measure, whether or not it's happening or not happening. So being able to describe what it looks like and sound like will be very helpful to everybody involved, because if we're going to be collecting data, we need to be measuring the same thing. You couldn't use something like verbal aggression. Well, verbal aggression could mean anything from issuing threats. It could mean talking loud. It could actually mean, not even talking loud, but somebody's body language where they're hovering over you and saying certain things and making people uncomfortable. But those are all very different behaviors, and so one person is waiting for the threat, and somebody else is chalking up, yep, we got an incident of aggression over here because he talked loud, then we're looking at apples and oranges, and you're not going to make a whole lot of sense out of what's triggering which thing, because we got different behavior. So you want to be very clear about what it is that we're focusing in on, and that everybody understands that. And you want to describe it in objective sort of ways. You don't want to talk, he's being disrespectful. Yeah, and that's subjective on both sides of it, because there are things that some people can hear and not think much about it, and somebody else be super offended. And then there's things that kids can say because nobody has told them that, no, you have to talk to adults differently than you talk to your peers. And so they're saying something, but they're not meaning to be disrespectful about it. They're just, oh, I didn't know that. So anyway, but you want to use objective. What can you see? What is it that you see? You want to collect information about when the behavior occurs, and when it doesn't happen. So doing observations, again, your data collection, whether those are behavior charts and logs, and I've seen some detail down into the 15-minute increments. It can be activity by activity throughout the day, but your bottom line want to find out when are the behaviors happening and when are they not happening? Because like I said, both sides of that are potentially useful. Talk to the child, talk to the parents, talk to the staff, talk to folks, because everybody's going to have their own perspective on it. And whoever's leading the functional behavior assessment, again, no one person does it, but there should be somebody who's sort of leading it and pulling this information together. And that individual should be getting information from more than one source. So that they are getting some of this different perspective here. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do is get enough information to identify some patterns. And part of those patterns may help us understand that there might be some, what the triggers are. So what's going on before and after. So slow triggers can be something like the kid overslept, had a really rough morning getting out to the bus stop, and so he was cranky from step one and therefore not very tolerant of the next thing, that was going to irritate him. And he goes off the deep end, but he doesn't sleep well a lot of times. So, okay, so we may have slow triggers. And then your fast trigger can be that other poor child that just bumped into him in the hallway when he was having a bad day. So we see the bump, that happened, but we didn't realize that necessarily that he was sort of set up for having a bad day before he even walked in the building. So it's like, what's going on? It could be changes in meds. It could be stuff that's going on with them physically. It could be things going on in the household, or a general sense of nobody likes me, that's now pervading, their whole approach to everything else that happens in the building. So you got slow triggers, fast triggers. And then, to get what's going on in the kid's life that's going to help with putting some of this together. So, what's their state in terms of, and we say mental, that can be sort of their current mental state, or it can be, do they have ongoing mental health challenges for that matter? Does the kid have some a history of anxiety disorders, and now we're putting them in situations where maybe they're being triggered. What's happening with them physically, where are they with their skills and abilities? Are we asking things of them that they're maybe not capable of doing? What are their preferences? What are their interests? And the quality of relationships and friendships. Human beings are by nature social beings, and when folks can't figure out how to have quality relationships, it tends to, make life bad for them and hard in lots of other kind of ways. And those challenges, again, sort of set them up for having poor responses to other situations. So at the end of the day, we're getting this information and trying to use that to come up with a best guess about what we think the purpose of the behavior is. And your hypothesis statement is going to read something like this. When this happens, or this is going on, such context, in this location, and this happens, the student does this, and we think it means this. Now, it may turn out the location is not the issue. It may be more of the thing that's going on, and that thing can be happening in a variety of places. So the fill in the blanks can vary slightly, but what bottom line is we're trying to figure out what is at play here and what's contributing to the behaviors, and what purpose the behaviors are serving for the student. You're going to use that information from the FBA to develop your behavior intervention plan. Behavior intervention plan is not a behavior contract. It's not just a list of here's what we want you to do. There's some official stuff that should be part of it if it's a decent plan. You want to have some prevention strategies that help set the student up for success. What can we do in the first place to prevent some of these behaviors from happening? You want to teach the child replacement behaviors so that whenever they are triggered or whatever the problem is, that they have some alternative ways of responding that are more appropriate than what they're currently doing. You want to build their overall general skills. because usually somewhere at the root of a lot of the stuff, there are going to be some skill deficits, whether it's communication or social skills or whatever, so that they are going to be better able to function long term. How are we going to respond to the behavior? That should be something that gets discussed. So are there ways that folks can respond that's going to sort of de-escalate situations and not allow them to escalate, let alone cause them to escalate? And then for situations where the target behaviors are things that really are potentially impacting health and safety, kind of deals, then you want to have a crisis intervention plan. So what do we do if this thing happens here? But there still should be some discussion about when are we going to kick in that crisis intervention plan too, so that we don't have everybody going into, we're going to call that SRO, or you don't call them every time something happens, but under what circumstances do we resort to this thing? So, okay, so we got a multifaceted plan. Your prevention strategies, as I said, those are the things that you're going to do proactively to help reduce the likelihood of behaviors occurring. Where the kid is situated in the classroom, what's going on around them. You do want to remind them of what the expectations are. We got parents that do that outside of school. I mean, when you go to the grocery store, remind the kids that, okay, this is what's going to happen, or else we're going to have to leave the store. We're not going to have this tantrum, going on here. Is you get one toy, or you got da. So you go through the little rules, but reminding people of what the expectations are in the particular settings, because they may be different in the music room than they are in the regular classroom than they are in the cafeteria. So for some kids, you got to be very specific with that, as far as what condition or what the expectations are for that particular event, activity, or location. Avoid known triggers if you can. You're not always going to be able to do that though, right? So if there's times that we know problems are more likely to occur than others, then try to provide some additional support during those high risk situations. Again, the parent I talked to yesterday whose kid wound up being found on the street also has issues when they're walking through the building. So it's like, okay, if we know that when the class is moving through the building, some adult can stay within an arm's reach. The teacher doesn't have to be at the front of the line or the back of the line. Somebody can be next to this kid without it even being conspicuous, or obviously anybody who's just walking down the hall, they just think this person's walking with the class, so the child doesn't have to feel like they're being singled out and targeted. But yeah, you're keeping an eye on them and keeping them close enough that you see them starting to bolt, there's enough time to respond before they're out of reach here. So again, just something as simple as that can stop a potentially really potential dangerous situation from happening. You also want to stay alert and observant so that you notice the first sign of trouble. And this is another place where the parents' knowledge of the child can come into play. A lot of times, parents, especially if you got a kid that's got a disability that tends to, that's connected with behavior kind of things in there, is they've learned their child well enough that they know that when they start twisting their hair, or when they start gritting their teeth or biting their nails, or whatever it is, they may be giving some very subtle signs that they're uncomfortable, that they're not, feel their body language may change, whatever. And they may just sort of automatically, would you like to go so-and-so? Or, they'll redirect them or offer assistance, whatever. And again, it may happen more or less even unconsciously, but those cues may be things that school staff can learn to pay attention to as well. And that may enable them to sort of intervene much earlier in the process, instead of waiting until after there's some sort of full-blown, incident happening. And now we're noticing that there's a problem here. So, looking for those signs in places where you can step in and do something to sort of derail that. I'm trying to think something. my little analogies are getting sort of crossed up in there, but anyway, we want to prevent the escalation. So stop that train. It's kind of, I wouldn't say derail that train, but I was talking about my train of thought getting derailed, and so it's kind of okay. But yeah, but you want to stop that process from just continuing to roll and get worse. All righty, we're teaching skills is an important part of your behavior intervention plan. Some of those skills are going to be your replacement behaviors. I think some people we're teaching them alternative behaviors kind of thing, but these are going to be behaviors that serve the exact same function as the problem behavior. So there should be a pretty direct correlation here. So maybe, instead of slamming your book down, just because you can't find the page or whatever, I'd rather you, raise your hand or you can do something else. You give them a direct something to do. Don't storm out the room, show me a card, let me know that you need to go to the bathroom, or that this is you let me know that you need to go down to the counselor's office for a few minutes to regroup and cool down, kind of thing. But just don't walk out the building out the room, because it's going to create problems, because now we don't know if you're going to be safe or not. So you're going to teach them something, say a direct correspondence here. So your replacement behaviors. Then, as I said, a lot of times there's some underlying skill deficits that are contributing. Even kids that just have academic skill weaknesses, maybe nothing going on, on a wonky sort of neurological level that's exotic, but they don't want to be called out or called to read in class because they're embarrassed. And so they may act a fool to avoid that part of the day, that activity. It's like, they can learn that, well, if I do this first, and by the time we get around to that, I'm already out of the room. And I attended a conference one time, and a guy who actually was an expert, made a statement that kids would rather be thought of as bad than dumb. And now, of course, this is me thinking in terms of kids using that language, but that's a fact. Nobody wants to have the spotlight on them and have their weaknesses shown up if they can't do something everybody else in the class can do. They don't want spotlight on that. But we still need to build those skills. So if the kids' issue is they don't read very well, then we need to work on their reading skills. Yes, we want to teach them how to better handle situations where they might be embarrassed or da. But how about we build the reading skills? So then it's not necessary, and the same thing for these other areas. So often communication skill deficits are part of what the dynamic is for some of these, behavior issues. And a lot of times kids that are that they're nonverbal or have serious communication challenges, people kind of stop working at it once it gets functional for them, as in the adults in the environment. I've heard folks say, well, yeah, her skills are communication is adequate for a classroom, and what they mean is the child can respond to their questions with a yes or no. That doesn't mean that child can express that they have a need, or that they're uncomfortable, or that they want something or whatever, so that they don't have the capacity to initiate. But for the purposes of getting through the school day, yeah, they're adequate. Well, no, they're not really. So again, the communication needs to continue to be built until somebody can, more or less make their needs known, and basically initiate conversation and effectively, communicate messages and stuff. So you don't stop working on communication just because you hit a certain point. You keep going at it, because those kind of challenges will manifest, in some kind of behaviors sooner or later. All righty. So anyway, and again, social skills deficits and stuff like this, you want to continue to work on these underlying weaknesses and needs so that the student will eventually not need to resort to the challenging behavior. Okay, so if we solve problem A, then we don't have to worry about problem B. That's going to take time, though, and certainly those skills are going to be the kind of skills that are well suited for IEP goals, for sure. The replacement behaviors, since they are kind of this one-to-one thing, a lot of times you're going to teach those quicker. IEP goals for things that are going to take a long time to master, that kind of thing. So then we get to the self-regulation training, and then because we all are going to find ourselves in situations that don't make us happy, rather it's a matter of being, again, frustrated, bored, whatever the case may be, fill in your adjective here. But we have to learn how to tolerate certain stuff and how to function within it without losing our minds and, causing problems for ourselves and other people. So how do they deal with those situations? Giving them tools, teaching them tools for how to handle that stuff. And this is where the reminder about we're looking at helping kids long term, prepare them for life. As adults, they're going to be having to deal with this stuff. So again, we're not just getting through school day or a week. We need to teach them skills that they're going to be able to use in the real world, in the community, to help them be able to function and have options. So there needs to be discussion about how those skills are going to be taught, where the child's going to have opportunity to practice the new behaviors and the new skills that we're teaching them. But at the end of the day, the core focus of the plan is that the student is going to grow. We want to grow their skills. We want to grow their confidence. We want to grow their capacity to participate in a larger range of activities and functions. We want to grow their connections to other human beings. But it's all about growth. It's not just about stopping them from being a nuisance to other people. So like I said, some of these skills are going to be appropriate to establish IEP goals for. All right, so now we're teaching them stuff. We need to reinforce those skills when the child is actually practicing them. So when they're using their replacement behavior, we need to reward that, effectively. Because if we say, for example, well, instead of you just blurting out in class, raise your hand, and wait your turn to speak. Well, if they raise their hand and don't get called on, they're gonna go back to blurting because blurting was working, right? and if raising the hand doesn't work, then they're not going to do it. So we want to make sure that we're reinforcing, and rewarding them for using the behavior so they understand that, no, this is actually an effective strategy for getting my need met, right? So I'm accomplishing what I want to accomplish and doing it in a way that's more acceptable and appropriate and people are happy with me. If it works, then they'll stick with it. But if it's not working for them, then they'll go back to doing the stuff that they're used to. These other general coping and tolerance skills, as well, whenever as they're moving along, you want to reinforce those and help them feel like they're making some progress and success. And you also want to not let the old behaviors work for them. So if whatever they were doing before effectively got them out of a situation that they didn't want to be in, you make sure it doesn't get them out of that situation. It may be a matter of instead of, well, we used to send them out of the room to the office. Well, no, how about we just gonna let you here, someplace where you're not causing issues for somebody, but you're gonna stay in the room and yes, you're still gonna do this work. You may not do it right this second, but you're gonna do it. So they don't get this avoidance thing. It's not successful. So you want to make sure you're not rewarding that problem behavior because they're still going to, come back to it. Old habits die hard. So this is part of the helping them die. And set reasonable expectations. Again, you're not going to have miracles happen overnight. It should be progress. But you want the students to feel like they were having and experiencing some success. So your expectations and sort of next, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble talking here. I'm getting my mouth and brain out of sync. That happens from time to time. You want to make sure that we're, again, not setting the goal so high that the student can't reach it. If you set the expectation at a level that wow, we got there. And then you can bump it up. And the same thing with the reinforcing stuff. For a while, yes, you want to call them every time they raise their hand pretty much. But then you can start fading that. Once they sort of feel like, okay, this works, then you can get to the place of, okay, hang on, let me get to this one first. Or you've already answered one question, let me do this. Whatever. You can start fading those reinforcements and prompts and all that. But when you're first putting something into play, you want to, go at it pretty intensely. So details matter. Figure out who's going to do what, when, where, how, and your backup plan. So say we got a kid who's going to go to someplace for a cool down area. It's going to be the counselor's office. Well, what happens if the counselor is not there that day or they work with another student and doors closed? Have a plan B. But if you work out the plan B ahead of time, we don't have a frustrated kid standing there now with his one outlet closed to him. You work out all those little kinks and logistics in advance. Okay, let me time check here. All right, so our desired outcomes here, obviously, we're looking to see problem behavior go down, adaptive behaviors go up, which should in turn lead to improve educational performance. And educational performance and learning aren't necessarily the same thing, but they will dovetail. So if the one goes up, the other should improve as well, but they're not the same thing. Improve relationships, like I say, that is so important to people and certainly to kids, and ultimately having a better quality of life. That's what we're going for here, is not just trying to make life a little bit easier for us, as we want this kid to have a better life. All right, so now we can stop for some Q&A about PBIS and the stuff that came before, and then we'll slide into the discipline piece of it. So,
Okay, so what we have so far, we have a couple of questions, and one question was when you were talking about um, instead of just sending the child home. So a question came up that said, at what point does a preschool child with an IEP who has extreme challenging behavior get a pass to continue displaying aggressive and harmful behavior towards peers and teachers? Can the IEP team change the child's placement to home if there are no other classroom placements available that would be suitable for the child to attend a full day? Of course, in order to meet the funding, they must have about 18 preschool children in every classroom.
okay, so to work this all out for me here. I would say number one is kids don't learn how to do school by not being at school.
Mm,
Okay, so sending them home isn't going to prepare them for that school environment any better.
mhm,
You certainly want to exhaust your options for supports. I'm saying bring in people, to try to come up with some ideas on what can be done differently to better support a student. Try to enlist, the parent as part of this process. Again, this should be a full court press here,
mhm,
because it may be, if nothing else, a matter of the parent being on the part of the reward for the kid being good, but they may also know some things about their child and what works and what doesn't work that may be helpful to you. And there are some things, that, okay, if you do this, this is going to make things worse, and so not to do that, because it may be something that seems like common sense or commonplace, for you to do, but if for whatever reason that sets its kid off, then how about we
mhm,
don't do that if we can, try to avoid it. So anyway, there may be some learnings that can happen, just by having a communication. So if we're talking about preschool kid, if they've got an IEP, then yeah, it can be an IEP team meeting where you got, parent, teacher, and other professionals. Again, pull in the behavior specialist if you need to. If the kid's on a spectrum, pull in the autism specialist, to try to get some wheels going. Um, uh, the sending them home should be the last resort. As we look at it, even on your scale of continuum of services,
mhm,
of alternative placements, is that's the most restrictive environment possible.
mm,
And it's going to do very little to prepare that child to come back into the school environment, more successfully. So
got
it's
you.
like figure out something else if you can.
Thank you. Should the PBIS framework, prevention strategies, and implemented consequences be considered before making changes?
I'm not sure I understand that question, because the PBIS is it's the PBIS approach or framework is more or less a how you think about the
Mm-hmm,
behaviors, right? Is the fact that no,
mm-hmm,
these behaviors aren't just happening, they're happening for a reason. Let's try to figure that out. And that can happen informally. It doesn't have to be okay, we're going to bring in somebody to do a formal functional behavior assessment, blah, blah, blah. You as a classroom teacher or somebody can sit there and just be thinking that way, is why is this kid doing this stuff?
mm-hmm,
Or why is
mm-hmm,
this escalating? Or why am I seeing more of it now than I was
mm-hmm,
before?
mm-hmm.
But thinking about the why, because the why is going to give you the what to do next.
Right,
And that's sort of the bottom line is you go from, yeah, this is what I'm seeing. It's happening for a reason. Let's try to figure that out and then come up with something that addresses that. So
got you. Thank you. Another question is what considerations are considered when moving a student from a general education classroom to a special education when they're in a Title I pre-K? Like when would you want to advocate for them to be in an LRE or least restricted environment, excuse me?
well, the least restrictive environment is going to be different places on a continuum because it's the least restrictive environment for that child. Okay, so where their needs can be met. So you always, your default is going to be a general education kind of setting, whether it's preschool or school age kids. But that doesn't automatically mean that that is the child's least restrictive environment, but you start there. And the
Mhm.
question is, what can we do to help the child be more successful here? And then look at what needs to happen, what kind of adjustments. From there, it shouldn't be an all or nothing kind of deal. It's,
Right.
their alternatives shouldn't be automatically. Again, at preschool, you got fewer options than you do for school age kids. Obviously, again, you're gonna have the full spectrum there. For preschool kids, you don't have quite as many steps along, the continuum to pick from. But still think in terms of how can we partially, again, you don't jump from one extreme to the other. See if there's something in between. Maybe that middle ground is going to be where the right spot is for that, maybe that child's LRE.
Okay. Thank you. Um, there was one, but I asked for clarity, so um, I won't be asking that one.
All right, but
Oh,
let me. Oh,
okay. Go ahead. No
I was gonna say
worries.
I want to touch on the discipline stuff. So let me go ahead and hop
Okay.
through that, and then when you get the other thing, we can, because it will be another break. All right, discipline. The root of the word, bottom line, means instruction, and we talked about how PBIS is talking about teaching kids new skills. So it really kind of brings discipline back to the very roots and what it was intended to be about. But there are some specific requirements when it comes to discipline and students that have IEPs that IDEA speaks to. The first thing in that discipline section starts off with school personnel basically have the authority to look at each situation on a case-by-case basis. It's not, you don't have to go autopilot. Well, a child committed this infraction, that means that you automatically gets 5 days off, automatically get 10 days off, or whatever it is. It
Mhm.
doesn't have to be automatic. You can take a minute, consider all of the circumstances. And those circumstances can include everything from what the child, not just the area of disability in terms of their category, it's the nature of their disability. You're right, because kids have, may have similar labels or even similar diagnoses. Um, but it expresses itself in very different kind of ways. But what do we know about the child's disability? How how they function? What was their intention? Because somebody who's just upset and flailing about and accidentally hit somebody is
Mhm.
different than somebody who walks up to you, and cold cocks you because they meant to, to do you harm. So, what's the intent of it? And just other relevant factors. It's kind of take the big picture into consideration and apply common sense uh to the situation. You don't, what the person asked other question about the preschool kid is, when do we stop letting this kid just have a pass? Well, you don't have to necessarily, it's not about he gets to just do this stuff, and we're just going to pretend that that's normal and let him disrupt the universe for everybody else and that kind of thing. But you don't automatically just kick him out of school either, because say you figure out, okay, what can we do to make it better, and try to improve the situation. So responses and consequences can happen, but school officials have the authority under IDEA. So if anybody ever asks, well, how come you gave this one, they both were fighting, but you gave this one this consequence and this one got a different consequence, you know, without, violating anybody's confidentiality, there may be underlying reason for doing so. All righty, but here's the big bugaboo here. Is when students are facing a disciplinary change in placement. All righty. Now, what is a change in placement? That can be anything from a series of removals that add up to a total of 10 days or more than 10 days. So it could be a day here, 2 days there, 3 days here, whatever. But once it exceeds more than 10 school days, that's generally considered a change in placement, and especially if it happens fairly close together. So you're going to consider how closely together those removals are. If it was like 2 days in September and then they didn't have another issue until to March, and then something happened in May, those aren't close enough that you're necessarily going to say that that's a change in placement, but that's generally we're looking at that exceeding the 10 school days cumulative. If they are being recommended for long-term suspension, yep, that's a straight up change. So was a transfer to an alternative school. If think about putting on school bound, a modified school day. Now I put the little asterisk behind the homebound and modified school day because kids may be in those situations based on their actual disability related needs or health needs or something to that effect, just as an IEP team decision, right? If that's appropriate for them. If somebody doesn't have the stamina to make it through a school day physically, then they may have a modified school day, but not as a disciplinary action. So we're talking about disciplinary changes in placement. So things that are being done um, in response to the child's behavior. In-school suspension without them receiving their educational services, would count as a removal. So when we add up those 10 school days, those days count. Repeated early dismissals, those are disciplinary removals that should be kind of logged here. If we're sent bouncing a kid out of their classroom to another classroom, being sent to the office or some other location, and they're out of their educational environment and not receiving instruction, that's a removal. If they get kicked off the school bus, when that's the only way they can get to school, it's a removal because you're de facto, denying a child access to school. So all of these things can amount to a change in placement. And a change in placement triggers a responsibility to start looking at the connection between the child's behavior and their disability. So whenever you finally hit that threshold, whether it's a one-shot deal, sending you to alternative school, or it's been the sort of cumulative thing, and now we've hit that last suspension that's pushing us over to 10 days. There should be a manifestation determination review meeting scheduled. It has to happen within 10 days of that decision. And the participants are going to be somebody representing the school district, your parent, relevant members of the IEP team. So you're generally going to get your IEP team, maybe plus some other folks. And whoever is responsible for discipline at the child's school was frequently part of the manifestation meeting. But they'll look at all relevant information in the child's file, including their IEP. And when we look at the IEP, we're looking at things like, does the child have IEP goals for those very same behaviors? Because if they do, then we know that's clearly been part of their pattern up to this point. It's not something that just came out of nowhere, so it's a known challenge that this kid has. So you're looking at the information in the IEP, observations, information provided by the parent. Now, this information provided by the parent shouldn't be, hey, I'm showing you documentation of my kid's diagnosis for the very first time ever. So we definitely encourage parents to look, if your kids, you got a private evaluation, they've been diagnosed with something, and you think it might show up, in terms of their behavior at school, let people know about it beforehand, because after the fact won't matter. You're not going to be able to play that card. So let them know so they can factor that in and take it into consideration. But anyway, the sum total information. What some teams get into is looking at just that kid's category of eligibility, but that's not how that's supposed to work. You can have a kid whose category eligibility is specific learning disability, but they also have been diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, or they've been diagnosed with ADHD. Well, if either of those things may be potentially, related to what happened here, then that has to be factored in. We don't have to just home in, well, his problem with math had nothing to do with why this happened over here. No, you're not limited to the category. You're looking at the child's disability, and that's everything. So, but the question you're trying to answer is whether or not the behavior was caused by or was it substantially related to the child's disability, or if it resulted from a failure to implement the child's IEP or behavior plan, if they've got one. So say the behavior plan or IEP call for them having a certain kind of support. Maybe somebody was supposed to be with them while they were walking down the hall because the kid's known to have issues with his peers, right? And nobody's been there for the last little bit, or maybe nobody was there that day. Okay. But that led to some incidents, kind of like, well, had things been happening the way they were supposed to, chances are that whole incident wouldn't have happened, right? So that would have been conduct resulting from the failure to implement implement the IEP. There could be other sort of connections there. It's not going to be a matter of, well, you didn't give me extended time on tests, and that's the reason why I got into a fight with Johnny over here. There needs to be some connection between where the breakdowns occurred and the behavior. But if either of these conditions are met, then the conclusion should be that the behavior is the manifestation of the child's disability. And if it is, then the child gets returned to their previous educational placement. And it got asterisk again, unless the IEP team sort of as a separate decision decides to do something different. And I'll give an example of where that happens. They're ordered to conduct a functional behavior assessment and implement a behavior intervention plan. If the child already has a behavior plan and a reasonably current FBA, because sometimes we get FBAs, but they were 3 years old when the kid was in middle school. Now they're in high school. Well, it's probably not relevant. So we need to do a new FBA. But if they do have a behavior plan, then review it and consider what kind of changes can or should be made to it to better support the student. Because again, if the behavior is part of their disability, you're not going to punish them out of it, right? So you have to help support them through it and help them figure out how to function better. So that's, you're building the other stuff. If the behavior is not a manifestation of the disability, then the discipline can proceed as though the student didn't have a disability, except that they still can get educational services while they're on suspension, while they're on homebound, while they're, whatever, so that they can continue to participate in the general education curriculum and make progress on IEP goals. So you don't get to sort of wash your hands of them and walk away. Even kids on long-term suspension, you still have to provide educational services. And you're still going to do that FBA and behavior intervention services, basically, to address the behavior, because ultimately we're trying to help that child function better. Even if it's not a manifestation, clearly there was a problem. And so you want to try to get to the root of what that was and figure out how they can be better supported and more successful. All right, then we got special circumstances. So even if the behavior was a manifestation of the child's disability, if weapons, drugs, or serious bodily injury are involved, then the student can still be moved into an interim alternative placement for up to 45 days. Okay, now it says up to, so it doesn't mean it automatically is 45 days, although when people usually look at this sort of clause here, that's where they generally go is, okay, 45 days over here. But no, it can be 2 weeks, it can be, whatever, it can be a shorter period of time, but up to, no longer than. And then they come back to their previous placement, unless the IEP team decides something different. Okay, so there's always opportunity for the IEP team to look at and go, look, this situation isn't working for them. So there's no point in putting them back into a failing situation, just to wait for the next pop to occur. And so there may be a decision to do something different, change their placement, change the services, or make some other alteration in order to better meet the student's needs. I'm looking at my little time here, and I've got an anecdote, but I'll save it until I make sure I've gotten through all the content here. All right, now when we talk about alternative placements, the first alternative option should not be homebound. You should only be looking at that if the IEP team agrees that that's the least restrictive environment for that student at that point in time, or least restrictive option available to them. I don't know that every school district has an alternative school. Certainly your charter schools don't. So, they may not have another place to park the child. But there should be a IEP team discussion and decision about it. But the child is placed on homebound, then they have to meet at least monthly, because that could be a change in placement that's ongoing, not just an interim thing. They have to meet monthly to consider whether or not this is still appropriate, for the child. It's not just having a meeting just to check the box and say we had a meeting. There should be some active consideration of, okay, what are we seeing? What's going on now? Can we move the kid back? Are they improved in their functioning? What's changed? Or have we made some changes to the setting or to the place that we're bringing them back to that we think is going to make it more likely the child's going to be successful? So there should be some active consideration. And they should also be getting services to help support them and address the behaviors again, so that we don't have, a repeat of the same incident. So you don't kind of just send them away and hope that time heals them. There should be some active, interventions and services provided to help them do better and learn how to function better. If they should still get their special ed service and their related services, as required by their IEP. Instruction that's supposed to be special ed instruction should come from a special ed teacher, not some randomly selected soul who's willing to work in the evenings. That kind of thing. But the IEP team would decide the type and amount of services the child receives during homebound. So again, this is another role of the team. Is they're deciding the placement, they're deciding the services, and making decisions about the kind of supports that are going to happen, and meeting regularly to revisit that placement. All right, so a few final thoughts just to wrap things up. The IEP is supposed to address all of the educational needs, even if they aren't normally part of their category. So, again, if a child has stuff going on that's manifesting behaviorally, even if their category has nothing to do with behavior, we still need to deal with it. Positive behavior intervention supports are demonstrated, proven, research-based. We know that it's more effective than punishment. It's more effective than excluding kids and isolating them and that kind of thing. So it's a proven effective strategy. Always consider least restrictive environment when selecting interventions. Again, don't go to homebound if you've got alternatives that can be utilized. Think about stuff, what's going to help us now, yeah. But also what skills can we teach this kid that they're still going to be able to utilize those tools long-term. If we're teaching a kid self-regulation tools, they should be able to continue using them, forever. You want to teach them stuff that's going to work for them for as long a period of time as possible, not something just, talking about turtles and frogs and whatever. That's cool for elementary school kids, but when they get to middle school, it's not going to be quite so cool. And so, we're going to have to learn some different strategies for that. So maybe choosing language that will flow with them and grow with them all along. But like I say, have that big picture in mind as we're planning different options. But, our goal, big time, is to prepare these students for life. So we're trying to help them be more functional human beings, and it distresses me to no end when I'm seeing kids that are in high school that are on homebound because folks haven't figured out how to manage their behaviors and such. And it's like, we run out of time. We're running out of time to get these kids ready for the world. We're running out of time to give them options in their life, because if you don't think they can function in a classroom, then they're never going to be able to function in the community. And that's pretty much closing the doors on their opportunities. And no, failure is not an option. Okay. So we need to be working on it and helping kids be as functional and as they can be. Okay. So that's where we get to our final little Q&A. Do we have one in there?
We do actually. We have so there was a question about a handout that you shared in reference to size requirement. And
Let me say again.
there was a question, there's a handout that has classroom size requirements per teacher. Does that include preschool? And if so, why not? Because, for instance, there was a mention earlier for 18 kids in a classroom.
Okay, policies governing services for children with disabilities, which is basically the regulations for implementing North Carolina's special education law, has class size. I do believe they use the word requirements as opposed to recommendations or guidelines.
Okay.
At the very back of it, so like the last 3 pages, you can look. And at the end of the day, even though they do have recommendations as far as, the class size and the ratio, the bottom line is that it has to work. So depending on the nature of the student's needs and what's going on, is you may need to have fewer than the max size that's listed there in order for it to work. Because if we got maybe 3 intense kids that are tying up a whole lot of staff time, then maybe we can't have 8 maybe we need to cap it at 6 or whatever. So the whole situation needs to work for the kids in terms of the staffing. So the 6-to-1 ratio, as in 6-to-1 teacher plus an assistant, because you always want to have 2 adults in the classroom, is sort of where you start for preschool. And then if you're going to add extra kids, then you add extra extra assistants or extra, adults to the setting to keep the proportion. Right. And then you hit a point at which that throwing extra bodies in the room isn't going to be helpful. So, if you got a classroom that's just kids with disabilities, you know, piling. Now this is my opinion on this one. Okay. But it's logical. Okay. And I can support that. Throwing 25 kids in there, it doesn't matter how many adults you put in that room, you could create a dysfunctional environment. It may be too loud, it may be too busy for kids to focus and function and be able to do what they need to do. There may be too many people taking up space for them to move around, comfortably in a room. At some point, it's just too many bodies. So just putting bodies in there isn't always going to be the answer. You've got to look at the whole picture. So at the end of the day, yes, there are guidelines that are, listed in the policies and their requirements, and they do go to preschool. They talk about preschool needs, regular preschool program, as well as the specialized preschool program. So they're there and should be utilized, but you don't always max it out as sort of the
Right.
point.
So with that answer, then there's this question, right? So at what point will it be acceptable to make decisions in the best interest of all the students in the classroom, other than the one you just gave, right? Not just a singular student. Because when the other students' needs, when the other students' needs are not being met, because of the student with the IEPs and the behaviors that they're contributing or that they're demonstrating, this is not even counting the unidentified students. So like when do people take into account all of the students instead of just the
Well,
individual?
you look at that question that we started off with early in IEP, where it says, does the student's behavior interfere with their learning or that of others? So, at step one, it's one of those questions that you're asking is, okay, it's not just about you, are you interfering with other people being able to learn? Um, but again, it's not going to be just an instant, okay, the solution is just to remove the kid. The solution may come down to that, right? But it's kind of like, that's just not your first choice. Is trying to figure it out. And if we can figure out a way of helping that child function better, that's going to work long, because he's going to go from preschool to kindergarten eventually. Okay. And he may go into kindergarten no more functional than he was in your classroom, in the preschool classroom, if nothing changes. So, at some point the kid does need help, with learning how to manage stuff. And if there's certain things in that environment that they just can't handle. I mean, maybe they don't need to be in a group of 18. Maybe that's just too much activity and not enough um personal attention. These maybe kids that do well one-on-one, with somebody working on them, but the minute you walk away and you're doing whole group stuff, then they're having all kinds of issues. Well, maybe that kid does need to be in a smaller setting where they can get more of that individual attention, and have people redirect them more frequently and such as that. If it's just redirection, honestly, then extra staff will solve that problem. But if we're talking about them, like I say, having meltdowns and throwing stuff around the room and being, seriously disruptive, yeah, I've said many times, and again, we work with parents all the time, is like one person's rights end where somebody else's begin. And those other kids do matter. They're entitled to an education too. They're entitled not to be punching bags. They're entitled not to be bitten when they go to school. So yes, there's always that trade-off there, and there's no written line in the sand, but it's a judgment call. Where you decide that this isn't working. We've tried stuff, we can't make it work, and at this point, it's costing everybody else, and we can't continue to make all these kids pay. Because if it's that bad, then chances are this kid isn't getting a whole lot out of that situation either, right? If they're spending half their time flailing about or doing whatever, and running amok, they're probably not getting what they need out of that setting either. So, but that's a judgment call. It's not going to be, a written line in the sand someplace. But, again, people use common sense. But clearly the other students do matter. They have rights too.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we're at 8:06, and I was going to anecdote myself out of here. But we do have a thing. You can do the survey. I think I had a survey prompt. No, I had a quiz, and I don't want to, because I got the quiz questions loading one at a time, so I'll be like 14 presses to get to the survey. So if you want to go ahead and pop that up, and while they're doing the survey, I'll share my little story.
Got it.
Um, a former coworker, had a son that had bipolar disorder, and he had an issue with the school, and it was trying to spare all the details in here, but ultimately he inadvertently wound up, well, it was Byrd, bought a knife. The school was a pocket knife, but it was a pocket knife that his daddy had given him, and his father got killed shortly before in a motorcycle accident, so he died suddenly. And so he was just keeping that knife with him as a way of keeping his dad close to him. And after his father died, he had to relocate to another household in another state, even. Okay, so his whole life had been upended, and it was this one little thing he was hanging on to. He didn't brandish it, didn't threaten anybody with the thing. He just happened to go in his backpack, and some other student noticed. All right, so now we got a weapon. So we're at the manifestation meeting. It took some talking to get them around to seeing that basically poor judgment is one of the diagnostic criteria for bipolar disorder. And so we eventually wore him down and were able to get the decision that it was a manifestation. But we knew that it was not going to be really in his best interest to come back to that school. He had no bonds there, didn't have any friends there. The last thing that anybody had seen was him being hauled off like he was some kind of criminal. Okay, so he was not going to feel comfortable coming back into that situation, thinking that everybody was talking about him, pointing fingers, whatever, it just would have been really uncomfortable. He had 2 credits that he needed to earn to finish his high school to get his diploma. Okay, so instead of sticking him back in the situation that we knew was going to be super stressful, because it started off stressful, and only went worse after this, is, we agreed to change his placement to homebound. And basically he finished out his last 2 courses, got his credits, and got on with his life. Is that, okay, rather than put him where something else was like go wrong. But that was a decision based on his needs at that point. It wasn't a punishment deal. It was about, that's not the best place for him. Let's just let him get out of here, and graduate and get on with his life. So, there are times when, the decision can be, and I had another kid that went to alternative school and actually thrived at the alternative school, and parent fought to, against having him sent back to the homeschool. We fought against getting him into the alternative school. I was there helping her. And then once he got there and was doing really good, then we fought against I was sent back. It's like, hey, this is working for him. Whatever's happening here is working for him. So how about we not rock the boat, and just let him ride this out over in this location. So, all right. So we got most of the people responding here. I don't know. I can't even see. This time of day, my vision is not what it ought to be. I've been staring at computers way too long.
We currently have 22 out of 24.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, really good. Thank you all so much for completing the surveys in such a quick, timely manner. We really appreciate that. It really helps us know how we're doing.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, appreciate the
and
feedback, and we got, real quick stuff on the back end here that just has our
mhm.
contact information. And again, I'm not gonna be able to get to it without going through this other quiz, which we would have done if we had time. But when I will send out a PDF of the presentation, and it'll have 2 pages with some resources. I mean, it's not like gobs of them, but some key websites to get information about PBIS, and then some other things around if the child's having a manifestation determination review, there are certain, options that families have in terms of procedural safeguards and stuff where you can challenge that, i.e. following due process, where they'll do an expedited hearing, if you feel like the decision was a wrong decision,
Mhm.
and it can be, decided by the judge ultimately. But so that information is in your parent rights handbook. And so I was going to just attach that on the list there too. And identify a couple of organizations that also assist families with educational issues related to, if you feel like things are not happening as they should be in terms of fairness and that kind of stuff. So anyway, but those resources will be there. Our contact information and stuff is going to be there. And we'll get that out. It probably won't be instantly because I'm off for the next couple of days. Like tomorrow and Monday. Well, actually not, but on Monday. Enough about me. I hope you stop recording this thing, Triana, before we got to this part. If not, go ahead, stop.